Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of precision,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It feels almost engineered. You break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line through the bone, and the doctor just points and says, there it is.
Right. It's completely binary.
Yeah.
Broken or not broken. You can literally see the fracture, measure the gap, and you know the exact mechanical steps required to fix it. We rely so heavily on that visibility.
We do. But when you step into the world of predicting the future of humanity, that x-ray machine just completely shatters.
Yeah, it really does.
Because we usually understand history through the disasters we can see in the rearview mirror, right? The ruins we can photograph, the battlefields we can map
The
out.
memorials we can physically go and touch, yeah.
Exactly. But today, you and I are doing something entirely different for this deep dive. We are exploring the largest catastrophe that never happened.
Which is such a wild concept to wrap your head around.
It really is. We are digging into how a mathematically guaranteed, globally accepted apocalypse, one that was officially scheduled for the 1970s, was quietly canceled.
And critically, the massive hidden costs of that cancellation.
Right. And we're pulling this from a really wide range of sources today. We've got historical records of Cold War-era food politics, dense biological texts on plant pathology, intense sociological critiques of modern agriculture.
And the personal speeches of an Iowa farm boy turned scientist.
Yeah, which is my favorite part.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to uncover how this happened, what it cost us, and what this means for your own understanding of how humanity solves its biggest crises today.
And I think to really understand a canceled apocalypse, you have to genuinely place yourself in the psychological atmosphere of the late 1960s.
Right, because we can't just look back with the comfort of knowing everything turned out fine.
Exactly. You have to realize that in 1967, the absolute brightest, most credentialed minds across multiple disciplines were in terrifying agreement. I mean, they agreed that mass famine was unavoidable.
It's hard to overstate just how bleak that consensus was. Because, the post-World War II era saw incredible leaps in public health.
Yeah, antibiotics, better sanitation, massive vaccine rollouts.
Right, which is wonderful. Mortality rates plummeted globally,
Yep.
but it triggered a population explosion in developing nations that agricultural systems simply, they weren't built to handle it.
No, not even close. You had experts looking at the global data, and the data clearly stated humanity was flat out of time. The population was climbing at a rate that just completely dwarfed the global food supply.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the fears were deeply Malthusian, right?
Yes, grounded in the 18th century models of Thomas Malthus. But, they were being validated by mid-20th century data.
Right.
Malthus argued that populations grow geometrically, while food production only grows arithmetically. And if you look at the growth rate percentages from the 1960s, countries like India were seeing population increases of over 2% annually. In compound terms, that means a population doubles in just a few decades. Meanwhile, agricultural yields in those same regions were stagnant. They were relying on farming techniques used for centuries, so the lines on the graph were intersecting.
The Malthusian trap was springing shut.
Exactly. It was cold arithmetic.
And this wasn't just debated in, obscure, dusty academic journals. This was pop culture.
Oh, absolutely.
It was mainstream anxiety. I mean, it reminds me of how we experience modern doom scrolling today,
That's a really good comparison.
When the smartest people tell you the end is mathematically certain, it creates this cultural paralysis. Like Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb in 1968, and the opening lines are just chilling.
Oh, they are brutal.
He writes, flat out, that the battle to feed all of humanity is over. He stated that in the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people were going to starve to death, regardless of any crash programs embarked upon.
And that book sold millions of copies. It articulated the underlying dread of the era. So the geopolitical mindset shifted rapidly to accommodate this grim arithmetic. Policymakers in Washington, London, across the West, they began adopting battlefield logic.
Right. Triage.
Yeah, they shifted to triage.
Which is what makes the 1960s so wild to read about now. You think of triage in a war zone hospital, right? Deciding who is superficially hurt and will live, who you can save with immediate surgery.
And who is simply too far gone to waste finite medical resources on.
Exactly. But William and Paul Paddock took that hospital logic and applied it to entire nations in their 1967 book, Famine 1975.
Yeah, the Paddock brothers were highly influential, and they literally divided the developing world into those three triage categories.
Right.
You had nations that had enough agricultural capacity or money to weather the storm. You had nations struggling but savable with targeted aid. And then you had the hopeless cases.
The can't be saved category. I was reading their specific criteria for this, and it is a horrifying mental image for you to think about. Just picture serious, credentialed policymakers sitting in boardrooms looking at a world map and just crossing entire countries off.
Because they argue that sending food aid to the hopeless nations was worse than useless.
Yeah, they believed food shipments would only keep people alive long enough to reproduce, which would just ensure a larger, more catastrophic famine a few years later.
And the most prominent nation placed in that hopeless category was India. We are talking about hundreds of millions of people
It's
here.
written off.
Written off. India had suffered successive monsoon failures in 65 and 66. The Paddock brothers and a lot of policymakers believed the math dictated India was already lost. Writing off a subcontinent was viewed as the only pragmatically humane choice left.
To preserve resources for countries that actually had a chance, it's so grim. Because when the smartest people in the room hand you a mathematical proof that the end of the world is scheduled for next Tuesday, the prevailing attitude becomes grim acceptance.
You just freeze.
Right. To stop a mathematical certainty of that scale, you don't just need good intentions. You need someone who is willing to look at the global consensus, look at the math, and completely reject the premise of the apocalypse.
Right. You need someone whose psychology isn't wired for geopolitical theorizing, but for relentless, practical problem solving.
Enter Norman Borlaug.
Exactly. Norman Borlaug was the total antithesis of those boardroom policymakers. Born in 1914, raised on a Norwegian-American farm in Cresco, Iowa.
He didn't come from academic royalty at all.
Not even a little. And his formative years were spent directly in the teeth of the Great Depression.
Right, which means the economic reality of the 1930s Midwest was brutal. He saw desperate, starving men begging for food up close, families losing farms that had been in their names for generations.
So hunger wasn't an abstraction or a line on a demographic chart for him. It was a visceral, immediate reality of human suffering. That Depression-era background is the lens through which he viewed his entire life's work.
It wasn't an economic dip to him. It was human agony.
Yeah, exactly. So he eventually attends the University of Minnesota, initially studies forestry, paying his way through with odd jobs, but he also wrestled competitively.
Okay, the wrestling background is, I think, the perfect metaphor for his entire scientific methodology.
Oh, for sure.
Because plant breeding, especially trying to outpace an ever-mutating fungus, is exactly like a grueling wrestling match. Wrestling isn't just about explosive strength, it's about agonizing endurance.
It's about leverage.
Yes, leverage. It's being exhausted, face down on the mat, and absolutely refusing to let your shoulders get pinned. And Borlaug brought that exact grinder mentality to plant genetics.
Which he definitely needed, especially when he pivoted to plant pathology under E.C. Stegman. Stegman was this demanding, brilliant mentor at the University of Minnesota who instilled in Borlaug a lifelong, almost personal hatred for one specific biological enemy.
Stem rust.
Stem rust.
Which, I mean, it sounds innocuous, like something that makes a vintage car look bad, but the biology of stem rust is terrifying if you rely on wheat to survive.
Terrifying is the right word. Stem rust is an aggressive, ever-mutating fungal pathogen. To really understand how devastating it is, you have to look at it at the cellular level.
Right.
The fungal spores land on the stem of a healthy wheat plant. If the conditions are right, usually warm and humid, the spore germinates and literally forces its way inside the plant's tissues.
It just breaches the hull.
Yep. And once inside, it develops this network of hyphae that act like microscopic vampires. They intercept the water and the vital nutrients that the plant is trying to pump up from its roots into the developing grain head.
So it literally starves the grain by intercepting the food supply.
Exactly. And it doesn't just quietly kill the plant. As the fungus reproduces, it violently erupts through the surface of the wheat stem, creating these dark, blister-like, rust-colored pustules.
It sounds awful.
It is. It shatters the structural integrity of the stem. The plant often just snaps in half. What you are left with is a shriveled, useless grain. A golden, life-sustaining field of wheat can be reduced to a black and rotting landscape of straw in a matter of weeks.
Unbelievable.
And those pustules release billions of new spores into the air, which catch the wind currents and travel hundreds of miles, spreading the devastation across continents. Stegman taught Borlaug that this was a relentless enemy that had to be fought without mercy.
So Borlaug gets his PhD in 1942, does a brief stint in wartime chemical research, and then in 1944, he takes a job with a Rockefeller Foundation program in Mexico, a job that essentially no one else wanted.
Right, because it was totally unglamorous.
Yeah. The Mexican agricultural sector was struggling massively. They were importing a huge portion of their wheat just to survive. Borlaug arrives, and he isn't handed a pristine laboratory.
He's handed poor soil, failing crops, suspicion from local farmers, and stem rust absolutely everywhere.
Zero scientific glamour. And he was tasked with breeding wheat that could resist the local strains of rust, right?
Yes. But plant breeding in the 1940s was a painfully slow game of biological roulette. You hand-pollinate a wheat plant, harvest the seeds, plant them the next year, and see if the offspring inherited the resistance.
You are entirely bound by the rhythm of the seasons.
Exactly. It typically took 10 to 12 years to develop a new, stable variety of wheat.
But Borlaug didn't have 12 years.
No.
The fungus was constantly mutating, constantly evolving new ways to attack the wheat. If you waited a decade to release a new seed, the rust would have already figured out how to bypass its defenses. He realized he was losing a slow-motion race.
So to beat the rust, he had to cheat time. He had to fundamentally break the rules of how agriculture was done.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, this is the botanical heresy.
Right. Because the established dogma dictated that you breed plants in the specific environment where they are going to be grown. Local adaptation was the golden rule. But Borlaug decides to implement what he called shuttle breeding.
Right. He starts growing 2 crops a year by physically moving his entire operation back and forth across Mexico. In the winter, he plants in the warm lowlands of Sonora. It's at sea level, the days are short.
Then he harvests those seeds in the spring.
And instead of waiting for the next winter, he immediately rushes them up to the cool, high-altitude central highlands near Mexico City, in Toluca, to plant a summer crop.
But wait, how did he get away with that? Didn't his superiors completely freak out?
Oh, they fiercely objected. The textbook stated unequivocally that this was a total waste of resources. The soils in Sonora and Toluca were entirely different. The altitudes were separated by thousands of feet.
Right. The climates were basically opposed.
The assumption was that a plant forced to alternate between such drastically different environments would fail to adapt to either and simply die out.
But sometimes the biggest leaps come from ignoring academic dogma. He was the guy with his hands in the dirt, and he just ignored the consensus and did it anyway. And it worked.
It worked perfectly. He achieved his immediate goal of cutting the breeding time in half, evaluating 2 generations per year. But by subjecting these plants to this crazy environmental shuttle, he accidentally unlocked a biological superpower.
He bred out the plant sensitivity to daylight.
Exactly. Photoperiod insensitivity.
Which is such a massive breakthrough. Explain why that's so important.
Well, most traditional plants are intimately tied to the solar calendar of their specific latitude. They use specialized proteins to measure the unbroken hours of darkness.
So they aren't just reacting to temperature, they're literally tracking the calendar by measuring the light.
Yes. A traditional variety of Canadian wheat waits for the long summer days of the northern latitudes to trigger the biological signal to stop growing leaves and start producing grain.
Okay.
If you take that same Canadian wheat and plant it near the equator, where the days are roughly 12 hours long year-round, its internal clock gets completely scrambled. It will just keep growing leaves, waiting for a long day that never comes, and it will never produce grain.
Oh, wow. So by constantly shuttling his wheat between the short winter days of Sonora and the longer summer days of Toluca, the only plants that survived were the genetic mutants that basically ignored the sun.
Exactly. Borlaug accidentally decoupled the wheat from its local solar clock. He created a photoperiod insensitive plant that would just grow almost anywhere on Earth as long as the temperature and nutrients were right.
That is incredible elegance and science right there. But solving the biological clock issue immediately introduced a brutal physical problem, the lodging problem.
Right. Because if you want to get massive yields out of a field, if you want to feed millions of people, you have to add chemical fertilizer. You have to feed the soil so the plant has the building blocks to make grain.
But traditional wheat varieties were biologically programmed to compete for sunlight, right? They grew tall and thin.
Yeah, so when Borlaug applied heavy fertilizer to his new rust-resistant wheat, the plants absorbed those nutrients and just went into overdrive. The heads of the wheat, the part containing the edible grain, grew incredibly dense and heavy, but the stalk of the plant remained spindly and continued to shoot upward.
Which is a structural nightmare. It's like building a 10-story skyscraper out of reinforced concrete, but resting it on the wooden frame of a single-family home.
That's exactly it. The physics just fail.
Yeah.
You have this massive, heavy ball of grain balancing 6 feet in the air on a thin straw. When the wind blew or when the heavy rains came, the stalks would buckle. Picture these fields of beautifully lush, tall wheat simply falling over and rotting in the mud precisely because they were fed too well.
It's dying from its own success. That collapse is what they call lodging. Once the wheat head is lodged in the wet earth, you can't harvest it.
So Borlaug realized he had to change the fundamental architecture of the plant. He needed to shrink the chassis so it could support the massive engine of the grain head.
And the fix for that came from a genetic strain known as Norin 10.
Right. Norin 10 was a Japanese variety of semi-dwarf wheat that was brought to the U.S. by an agronomist named Orville Vogel. Borlaug got some of this genetic material to cross with his Mexican wheat.
And the biochemistry here is amazing. The dwarfing genes in Norin 10 changed how the plant allocated its energy. When he crossed it with his day-length insensitive wheat, the resulting plant was just a tank.
A total tank. When you hit this new semi-dwarf wheat with massive amounts of fertilizer, it didn't waste that energy trying to grow 6 feet tall.
Right.
It channeled the energy straight into the edible grain. The stalk stayed short, maybe 2 to 3 feet high, and stiff enough to easily hold those immense fertilizer-fed heads of grain without buckling.
And the results in Mexico were staggering. By the mid-1950s, Mexico becomes entirely self-sufficient in wheat. Within a decade, they are a net exporter.
It was an incredible proving ground. But Mexico, despite its challenges, wasn't the epicenter of the global crisis. The true test of this super wheat was looming on the other side of the planet, where the doomsday clock was ticking loudest.
Right. India and Pakistan in the mid-1960s. The population is surging, the Paddock brothers are writing them off as a lost cause, and the subcontinent is hit by devastating back-to-back droughts.
The crops are failing. The triage experts in Washington are looking at the data and confirming their worst fears.
But Borlaug knew he had the biological key to avert the crisis.
He did. He had the seeds in Mexico. But this is where the story shifts, because having a magic seed in a silo in Sonora does not save a starving family in Punjab.
It's like an intense action movie, right? But instead of defusing a bomb with 1 second left, the heroes are planting seeds in the dirt while the audience is looking the other way.
Yes, and the logistics were a nightmare. They were fighting enormous bureaucracy. Indian politicians were highly skeptical of relying on a foreign seed. There were massive financing hurdles.
And then in 1965, the Indo-Pakistani War breaks out.
Right, so Borlaug and his team are trying to orchestrate this mass transfer of seeds while the two recipient nations are actively shooting at each other.
Seed shipments were literally moving under gunfire. I mean, they had shipping snarls, war zones. They're desperately trying to get these seeds into the dirt while the entire world is focused on the geopolitical explosions happening above ground.
And it is so critical to recognize that this was not a solo effort by an American savior. The Green Revolution in India would have completely failed without the indispensable work of Indian scientists and politicians.
Oh, absolutely. Like M.S. Swaminathan.
Yes, Swaminathan was absolutely vital. He was the champion on the ground who saw the potential of the Mexican dwarf wheat. He had to fight ferocious political battles against the old guard who wanted to stick with traditional methods.
They took an incredible political risk. They set up demonstration plots, lobbied for funds for fertilizer. They built the infrastructure that made it work on the ground.
And once the seeds were planted and the water and fertilizer were applied, the miracle happened. The apocalyptic math just shattered.
Wheat yields in India and Pakistan roughly doubled in just a few years.
You just don't see agricultural yields double in a single generation. It was a biological explosion.
India achieved self-sufficiency and actually ran out of storage space for all the wheat. They were storing surplus grain in schools and abandoned theaters. It's a staggering reversal.
And in 1968, William Goud at USAID observed this and coined the term Green Revolution.
So just pause and imagine this for a second. Imagine standing in a crowd of 1 billion people and realizing that they are all only alive because of a quiet man in a Mexican wheat field and a dedicated team of Indian scientists.
The global community eventually recognized the sheer magnitude of it. In 1970, Borlaug wins the Nobel Peace Prize, based on the premise that there is no peace without bread.
But I love the anecdote of how he found out. His wife, Margaret, actually had to drive out into the muddy rural test fields to tell him.
Yeah, he's covered in dirt, logging data.
She tells him he won the Nobel Prize, and he thinks it's a prank. He literally refuses to believe it and turns around to go back to work.
It perfectly crystallizes his character. He was utterly uninterested in accolades, purely focused on the work. But his legacy introduces a really challenging concept to analyze: the invisible good.
Right.
We easily comprehend a disaster that happens, right? We can photograph the rubble. But the human brain profoundly struggles to conceptualize a disaster that was canceled.
An estimated 1 billion lives were saved. But there are no monuments to funerals that were never held.
Exactly. And because he prevented an event rather than reacted to one, he remains largely anonymous to the general public.
Now, in any other story, the Nobel Prize is the happy ending. The hero wins, the world is fed, roll credits. But this deep dive isn't a fairy tale. Feeding a billion people requires an industrialization of nature that comes with a massive, unavoidable bill.
Nature always collects its debts.
So what does this all mean? Let's look at the shadow of the Green Revolution.
Well, let's unpack the mechanics of those inputs. The miracle wheat was essentially a high-performance engine, and it required high-performance, expensive, and ecologically taxing fuel to run.
Right, massive inputs, chemical fertilizers, heavy pesticides, and immense irrigation.
Yes, they didn't just grow better passively, they required synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. And because the wheat grew so densely, it created a microclimate that was a paradise for pests. So you had to apply continuous rounds of synthetic pesticides.
And the water requirements were insane. You couldn't just rely on monsoons anymore.
No, you needed massive, controlled irrigation. And the costs of that have been severe. If you look at Punjab in India, the poster child for the Green Revolution, the groundwater depletion is catastrophic.
Contrast the image of overflowing grain silos with the image of bone-dry aquifers and debt-ridden farmers in Punjab. It really makes the duality visceral.
They are essentially mining fossil water today. And the heavy chemical use degraded the soils, locking farmers into expensive chemical dependencies just to maintain yields.
Plus the loss of biodiversity, sweeping monocultures replaced a diverse array of resilient local crop varieties. If a pathogen mutates to bypass that one genetic defense, the whole system is vulnerable.
And socially, the new methods heavily rewarded farmers who could already afford the expensive seeds and fertilizers. It often widened the wealth gap dramatically. Small farmers couldn't compete, fell into debt, and lost their land.
Which brings us to the profound ecological and social criticisms, like Vandana Shiva's 1991 book, The Violence of the Green Revolution.
Yes, her critique is vital to understand. She argued the revolution did profound ecological and social damage, that it was an imposition of a violent extractive model that destroyed ecological balance and trapped farmers in debt to agrochemical corporations.
It's a genuine tension between feeding a population and preserving an ecosystem.
It is.
Yeah.
Because the counterargument is that if we had tried to feed the exploding population using low-yield organic methods, developing nations would have had to plow under millions of acres of virgin forests and wildlife habitats just to get enough land to grow the food.
So if the alternative in 1968 was hundreds of millions of people starving to death, were these ecological costs a tragic mistake? Or were they simply the brutal price of survival? Did we just trade a fast apocalypse for a slow one?
That is the defining tension.
So how did Borlaug react to these intense criticisms? Did he get defensive? Did he try to protect his legacy?
This is the most surprising twist of all. He entirely agreed with them.
Wait, really?
Yes. It is exceptionally rare for the architect of a global miracle to be its most clear-eyed skeptic. But you have to look at his 1970 Nobel lecture titled The Green Revolution, Peace, and Humanity.
What did he say?
Standing at the absolute pinnacle of global recognition, he explicitly stated he had not defeated hunger.
That is profound humility, calling your own life's masterpiece a mere delay.
He warned that the population monster was still coming. He estimated his life's work only bought the world perhaps 3 decades of time, 30 years.
Wow.
He argued he had provided a breathing space to get population growth under control and figure out sustainable ways to exist.
So in his later years, did he just retire?
No, he worked in Africa with the Sasakawa program and Jimmy Carter, trying to spark a second revolution. The results were more limited because the infrastructure and crops were completely different. But it was during this time he engaged in bitter arguments with Western environmentalists.
Right, because they were advocating for ecological pureness and opposing synthetic fertilizers in Africa?
And to Borlaug, this was infuriating. He accused them of being deeply elitist, of denying the world's poor the very technologies that had saved the West. He believed that technological intervention, despite its flaws, is a moral imperative when lives are on the line.
He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1977 and the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007. And he died in Dallas in 2009 at age 95, largely unknown to the billion people whose lives he saved.
A man walking unrecognized in the supermarket, despite saving more lives than perhaps anyone in history.
It's incredible, and it brings us back to you listening to this. We are living in the time that Norman Borlaug bought for us. We've explored the awe-inspiring triumph of the human mind today, but it is inextricably linked to the heavy, ongoing debt we owe the Earth.
It's a very complex legacy.
It is. Borlaug accused comfortable, well-fed critics of denying imperfect technology to the desperate. It makes you wonder, as we face tomorrow's global crises, whether it's climate change, energy, or AI, will the people demanding we abandon risky new technologies be the ones who already have full stomachs and safe homes? When a solution carries a toxic shadow, whose definition of safety gets to decide the future of the world's most vulnerable?
It's a question we'll be answering for a long time.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.